This video is best viewed full screen. Click on the full screen icon at the bottom of your screen to go full screen. The Presentation Manager allows you to stitch two spectra together side by side. We're going to look at two examples here. First, we'll stitch two low-resolution spectra that were captured with a star analyzer grating, and then we'll stitch several spectra captured with a higher resolution slit spectrometer. Okay, let's open the Presentation Manager and click on File, and then click on the Import Zipped Presentation menu option. In the RSpec Sample Spectra folder, I'll import the Denebula with Star Analyzer file. These two spectra were captured within a few minutes of each other on the same star with the same equipment. The only difference was our focus setting. You probably already know that your focus setting for a spectrum will be a bit different than the focus for a star. To see why, here's an image from the RSpec manual. Here's the star, of course, and here's the grating, and here's the zero-order light path from the grating to your CCD sensor. The path for the color spectrum is longer than the zero-order path. That's why for best results, we always need to do a final focus on the spectrum itself rather than on the zero-order star. But take a look at this. The path for the red light here is a little longer than the path for the blue light. That means the focus in the blue region will be a little bit different than the focus in the red region. This effect is greater for longer spectra, those with higher dispersion, and it's greater for the Star Analyzer 200 compared to the Star Analyzer 100. And that's true even for spectra of equal length, and it's because of the higher diffraction angle of the Star Analyzer 200. This difference in focus is also more pronounced on faster, low focal ratio systems, which have a smaller depth of field. Finally, a poorly corrected telescope with a lot of chromatic aberration will cause these focusing differences on different colors also. A wedge prism can be added to reduce but not completely eliminate these kinds of focusing effects. When we captured this first spectrum, we made sure that we had optimal focus in the blue end of the spectrum. We did that by taking multiple images and viewing each one here in RSpec. We changed the focus after each image using trial and error to determine the best focus on these features in the blue end of the spectrum. These hydrogen bomber features are clearly visible. Then we captured this other spectrum doing the same thing, but this time carefully focusing until this hydrogen alpha absorption line in the red end was most visible. But when we had the best focus on the red end of the spectrum, notice that these blue end bomber features that were visible in our first spectrum are almost invisible. So this spectrum has these features in the hydrogen beta and blue region, but it doesn't have this hydrogen alpha feature. And this spectrum has the hydrogen alpha, but not the hydrogen beta and blue features. The difference between these spectra is solely from focusing, and you can see that this difference can be significant. Whether your instrument behaves this way depends on the factors I mentioned earlier: dispersion, lines per millimeter of the grating, telescope optics, etc. The best way to know if this affects you is to experiment a bit on a brighter star. Try to get the best focus you can on a type A star and then examine the differences. The Presentation Manager will allow you to stitch multiple spectra side by side if you need to, so we can have the best focus throughout our final spectrum. Okay, that was a lot of introductory comments, wasn't it? But it will only take a moment for me to show you how easy this feature is to use. First, if this panel is invisible, click here. Then add a check mark to this Show Measure Lines box. When we first check this box, the measure lines won't be visible at all. They're still off screen. I'll grab one of them here and drag it onto the screen. Now next we have to decide how much of the blue spectrum we want to use and how much of the red spectrum do we want to stitch onto it. This is a little bit of a subjective decision at this point. The question we have to answer is, where does the red spectrum become better focused than the blue spectrum? Clearly this hydrogen beta feature in the blue spectrum is better focused than the red one. It's more symmetrical and it's deeper and more narrow, better full width half maximum. But I'm not so sure which spectrum is better, meaning better focused in this region. It's difficult to tell because there don't appear to be any major features. It's mostly just noise, it seems. But clearly over here, the red spectrum is better focused. We can see that hydrogen alpha absorption line that's not visible in the blue spectrum. So I'm going to drag the measure line somewhere between those two regions to mark where I want to stitch the blue to the red. Okay, now I'm ready to stitch. What RSpec is about to do is delete the blue spectrum starting at the yellow measure line and replace it with the red spectrum. It will also move the red spectrum up so that there's no big jump in continuity of the profile line. In other words, it will scale up the red spectrum so that at this point right here, the two spectra will meet. I'll click on Tools, and then I'll select the Stitch option. Notice, by the way, the shortcut key F3 that we'll use again in a moment. Okay, don't blink or you'll miss it. I'm going to click on 1, 2, 3. And that's all there is to it. So now we can have the best of both worlds, right? This is a composite stitched profile. It combines the best of two profiles, so we can see features in the blue end as well as in the red end. Want to see it again? Well, I can hit F2 on my keyboard to reload the previously loaded zip file. And then I can hit F3, which is a shortcut to the stitch menu that I showed you a moment ago. Isn't that fun? As I mentioned earlier in this video, you may not even need this feature to stitch spectra. The first step for you would be experiment with focusing. See if when using your equipment, the focus at the red end of your spectra is different than that at the blue end. If not, this feature doesn't offer you a lot. Okay, now let's stitch some slit spectra. Try saying that fast 10 times. It's a tongue twister. I'm going to select File and then Import Zipped Presentation, and then I'm going to select Capella in the standard sample spectra folder. Tim captured 4 spectra here. He needed to do that because with the high dispersion of his slit spectrometer, he can't capture the entire range of wavelengths in one image. To make his 4 spectra easier to see, I've given the lines different colors, but the colors I chose don't have any special significance. We can see here that Tim chose file names that include the date and the wavelength range of its spectrum, so that when he loads all of them at once, they're sorted properly in the grid. Okay, to start, let's stitch the red and yellow profile lines here. I'll move the measure line to where I want to stitch. It's a good idea to avoid major features, so I'll choose here. And then I'll use F3 to do the splice. There. Okay, now let's reposition the measure line to stitch the orange spectrum and hit F3 again. And now a final time. That's all there is to it. Pretty amazing, isn't it? We just stitched 4 spectra into this one spectrum in what, about 10 seconds. Okay, so to finish up this video, let's revert back to the unstitched spectra that we started with. I'd like to review what we just did. All I did was position the measure line where I wanted to stitch, and then I selected this Tools Stitch option or hit the F3 shortcut. But when I did that, how did RSpec know which 2 from these 4 profiles in the grid I wanted to stitch together? Well, RSpec always uses the bottom profile spectrum as one of the sources. And for the second profile, RSpec uses whichever numbered row is selected. So before you stitch, click on the row here in the grid that you want to be the right-hand spectrum that is stitched. Most often that will be row 1. RSpec will combine that row's profile with the bottom profile and put the result in the bottom profile row. So now you've seen what the presentation manager can do. Pretty neat, isn't it? You can now use the full screen icon to leave full screen mode.